functional levels. In this nugget, we're talking about functional levels. And the first thing we'll discuss is the domain functional level here. Wow, that's a huge D there. I don't know why I made that so big. Looks like the D's I used to get on my papers back in college. Anyway, I guess that actually should have been a domain functional level. But anyway, we're talking about the domain functional level. And this is going to be something that will give you various capabilities within your domain. The higher the domain functional level, the more features of Active Directory you get. The same thing is true of your forest functional level. The higher level you get in your forest functional level, the more features you get in Active Directory. And that's pretty much it. There's a lot involved in each one of those, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, as we get started talking about the domain functional level, the very first and lowest level domain functional level we can use is Windows 2000 Native. I'll try not to cross it out this time. There we go. Windows 2000 Native DFL, and that's just what I usually refer to it again as DFL. Now, notice this. You might have been accustomed to previous operating systems like Windows 2000 domains or Windows Server 2003 domains where there was something called a Windows 2000 mixed domain functional level or a Windows 2000 interim domain functional level. First of all, note that we cannot any longer have that because of a technical limitation. What is that? Well, what are the operating systems that you can have in mixed or interim DFLs? If you remember that, and if you were accustomed to those previous operating systems, you know that NT4 is part of the operating system for our domain controllers in both of those. Windows Server 2008 domains do not support Windows NT4 domain controllers at all. So that support is totally gone now. As a result, these are now nixed, so we don't have to worry about those. Also, for the domain controllers, you do have to have one of these operating systems in place. You have to have Windows 2000, Windows Server 2003, or Windows Server 2008. Another important thing to note about this is that notice that this is only for the domain controllers. Okay, I can have member servers that potentially are NT4 member servers. I don't know why I'd want to have that, but I could. I could have desktop clients that were Windows 98 or Windows 2000. So it doesn't really matter what my desktop clients are. I could even have Linux somewhere in there. Microsoft will probably swear me off if they hear me say that. But anyway, yeah, you could have Linux or Novell or anything else in the mix as long as all your domain controllers are one of these operating systems. And then basically what this gives you is just core functionality for Active Directory services. There's not really a whole lot to this domain functional level other than you get Active Directory. Now let's move on to the domain functional level of Windows Server 2003 DFL, where of course you can have Windows Server 2003 or Windows Server 2008 domain controllers. Again, always limited to domain controllers, not workstations and member servers. And one of the things you can do with this is to do something called a domain controller rename. Now, why would I want to rename my domain controller? Well, first of all, in your strategy for Active Directory, you should be pretty darn sure that you've got the domain controller names that you want as a naming standard. This is not something you want to commonly rename or just kind of change your mind arbitrarily with. Normally this is going to be something that's going to be pretty close to being carved in stone. But sometimes you do have to rename the domain controllers. Why? Well, you might have some kind of a restructuring that goes on, or maybe an ownership change so that a different company has purchased the organization and they have a different naming convention, for example. Or maybe your IT management has decided to rename domain controllers according to their geographic location. So instead of DC Nugget 1, which is what we're looking at right now, that's the computer that's running this whiteboard, maybe they want to rename that according to what city it's in. So maybe it'd be PHX for Phoenix, DC01. So those are some different ideas for how that could take place. Or they might rename them according to other things such as divisions or cost centers, things like that. Of course, the drawbacks for a domain controller rename are mostly temporary, but it could just cause a potential temporary service disruption. So that if a client is currently logged on having used this domain controller, and then we rename it, well, for a brief period of time, the client that logged on using this domain controller won't be able to find it. So it could be temporarily an issue, but once everything settles down through replication and through re-authentication and things like this, it should come back to life, and it should, from that point forward, connect just fine. Also, the other issue you might have with this is you may have some applications that are hard-coded to a specific domain controller. So if they're trained or hard-coded to look for DC Nugget 1, and I rename it to PHX DC01, well, then those applications will be lost, and who knows what they'll do. They might, blue screen. They might lock up a system. They might do who knows what. So you do have to be careful of those things in advance before you rename the domain controller. Now then, just for illustration's sake, you can see that I've made a remote desktop connection to DC Nugget 2. And from within this, I can right-click on Computer to rename a domain controller, and this is nothing unusual. You just go to your System Settings, which you need administrative permissions for. Then I'm going to the Computer Name tab, and then the Change button. And here, this just tells me that I might have temporary disruption since I'm trying to rename a domain controller. And then I could just rename this to whatever I wanted it to be, Phoenix DC01, for example. And that would pretty much be it. I would OK, and then I would have to bounce this server, or that's another way of saying restart it. I'd have to bounce this server, and then when it came back up, it would be properly renamed. The other thing I could do is go to an administrative command prompt, which you can see me doing with a right-click here. And then once you do that, you can use the netdom command, which I'm going to type in and then explain. And you see here that I've typed in netdom, which is a command we introduced several nuggets ago when we talked about server core. Computer name is what I want to change, and I just enter in %computer name % to enter in the default value, or the value of the computer name that we have here, /add colon, and then I have to enter in the fully qualified domain name for what I want the new name to be, and I'll press enter here, and we see that it has successfully changed this name, but we're not quite done yet. Now you can see here that the next thing I've done is typed in the netdom command again here, and it looks the same to begin with, but now what I have to do is to make this primary. I just /make primary, and then that's going to make that the primary name for this computer, and I'll press enter. This is also going to require a reboot. So I'm going to go ahead and shut down, space /r /t0. That means to restart the computer, and then in 0 seconds, that's /t is for time. So I'm going to go ahead and let that happen in the background, and then when it comes back up, I'm going to do yet one more netdom command, and then we'll see how we can complete the domain controller rename. Also, by the way, the only reason why I'm showing you the command line method, because that's an awful lot harder than just right-clicking on computer and changing the system properties, isn't it? Well, the reason why I show you this is because you might want to script this. If you have a large-scale migration of some type, and you need to rename a whole bunch of computers, or you want to have a more automated method for doing this, then netdom would be your tool to use. Alright, then after this computer is restarted, we now see that it's Phoenix DC01, and I'm going to remove remnants of the old computer name, and in order to do that, I do a netdom computer name, %computer name %. We've seen all this before. Now we do a /remove colon, and then the old computer name that I want to get rid of, and now we've successfully removed DC Nugget 2 as an alternate name for the computer. One thing I find interesting about this, though, by the way, is the spelling. Where did this come from? Alternate. Anyway, whatever that is. But you get the idea. It has now removed that from this computer, and that's pretty much all I need to do. One thing you also do need to be aware of, however, is that it was pretty simple in my environment because I only have 2 domain controllers. But you may need to wait for best consistency, to wait for or trigger replication between all your domain controllers so that they're all aware of the new computer name here before you go about removing the old computer name. And if you use Active Directory DNS integration, then that will also be helpful because that will should also update the name in DNS for you. Let's take a look at a couple of other things we can use here as well. There's some attributes here, such as the last logon timestamp and user password. This is just 2 different things that are new in Windows Server 2003's domain functional level. And let me just identify a little bit about what this second one is first. In Active Directory, you have another object class besides user called inetOrgPerson. I guess I should write that out. Okay, let's do this. inetOrgPerson. And what this is it's going to be an account that can be created that might be migrated or transferred from some other operating system that's maybe not Active Directory, but some other operating system, but you want to keep all the characteristics of that account. Well, by migrating that into Active Directory, it'll be known as an inetOrgPerson account. And as far as practical usability of it goes, it should work pretty much the same as any other Active Directory user account, but it's just got a kind of a special attribute to it. But regardless, what this user password item is just simply the ability to use the user password attribute as the effective password for both this inet.org person account and any other normal user account. But what I really want to show you here, though, is this last logon timestamp. This is pretty handy. Let me show you why this is very useful. First of all, if I go to Administrative Tools and Active Directory Users and Computers, notice that I do get one additional feature here if I use Active Directory Users and Computers in this method that I didn't have before. Now I have something called Saved Queries. Like if I go up to Server Manager, notice I don't have any of this Saved Queries stuff in there. So what I can do with this is to right-click and choose a new query, and then I can enter in a query for a specific item. So for example, I'll just call this, users logon. Okay, I'm not really trying to be too specific about that, but I want to go to the define query item, and we can see here that we have some common queries that we can use. Look at this one. This is the one I want to try to get at. Days since the last logon. I can choose a certain number of days here. So for example, if we know that any stale accounts where the user no longer works here, or maybe they're a student that's graduated, or something like that, where we don't see anybody for 180 days since their last logon, well then we can track those accounts down and kill them. Okay, that didn't sound very politically correct. I didn't mean that. Okay, I'm a nicer guy than that. But we can track those accounts down and delete them. How about that? Okay, and then I'm just going to do 30 days. I don't think I even have anything that'll show up, but let's just see if we get anything here. Yeah, apparently not, because I've got a pretty new domain here. So, but you could get the idea there. They would all show up here then, and then I could just get rid of those accounts, for example. And the reason why I'm able to do that, once again, is because of this last logon timestamp. Now, if you want to find another way to check that out, let's just do this. ADSI edit.msc. We've used this before as well in a previous nugget, but if I just go to my users here, and let's just use my own account, this trainer account, and if I right-click on it and choose properties, and I'm kind of going quickly through this because this is not really exam specific. You don't have to memorize this. I'm just showing you that you can identify that this information does appear. Then we can see this here, and let me I think it's somewhere in here. Oh, it's right in the top. There it is. The last logon, and that tells me the last time I logged on was, September 5th, and what time it was, and so forth. So you can see that attribute definitely is there that we can then make use of, and it might be useful for scripting things or to be able to find users that have logged on at a certain period of time. Also, other things that are included in that, by the way, would be able to identify which computer they logged on to as well. Another thing that's very useful here is the redirect user and redirect computer commands, which used to be downloads for previous operating systems, but they're included with Windows Server 2008. Let me talk to you a little bit about what these are. These are very useful because when I normally create a new user or computer account, I might do that in Server Manager, and I might just right-click here, in an OU that I'm interested in, and right-click choose New User. Okay, now that user account is going to be created here. But you might also have scripts or batch files or administrators who like to use the command line, and if that's the case, they might just do something like this: net user and then the name of the user, star, which means prompt me for the password, otherwise you could type it in explicitly, /add, and when I press enter here, it's going to ask me for, the password. I think I'm entering it incorrectly. Okay, and now the command completed successfully. So I say, where's that account going to go? Well, it's named Phoenix User 11, so it's probably in here, right? Oh, well, I got to refresh the screen, so let me do that. Oh, it still doesn't appear. Well, let me try it again. Well, you can see the account's not there. Where is it? Well, if we don't specify somehow, then it's just going to get dumped into this users container. Now, another command line utility that I could use is the dsadd user command, and with that one, you enter in the distinguished name, so you just type in the OU you want them to go into. But otherwise, this doesn't always work. Now, you can see here that, again, we still don't see the Phoenix user account, but if I refresh the screen, sure enough, there they are. And that's okay. I just got to drag them up here, and we just get a brief message saying that, the group policy objects might be affected that way. So now there's the user account. Well, that's a little bit of extra work I didn't really want to have to do, and it could create renegade accounts because we'll see later on that we can use group policy objects to tightly control virtually everything our users can see and do, to deploy software, all kinds of stuff like that. And you normally will link it to organizational units. And this OU, through inheritance, through other organizational units in here as well, might have had dozens of group policy objects attached to it. Well, if I just have accounts that get dumped into the users container, there's really no specific group policy objects that get applied there except for at the domain level, so it's very possible to accidentally create renegade users. Now the same would be true of computer accounts. If I just create computer accounts from the command line, they also will just get dumped into the computers container, which is not necessarily really where I want them to go. And you can see I've even got a computer account in there right now because of that very reason. So let's do this. Let's go back to our command line, and this time I'm going to use the command of redir usr for redirect user. It's very simple syntax. You just type in the distinguished location, and I'll just press enter here. You can see the container dn, for example, and that's all you got to do. So redir user, and maybe I want my users to go into how about this Phoenix users organizational unit. Well, I'm going to type in the rest of that. I'll pause recording, and I'll show you what it looks like when I come back. And so this is what it would look like. I do a reader user, and I'm entering quotation marks here because I have a space between Phoenix and users. Anytime you have a space, you do have to enclose the whole thing in quotations. So that's what I've done. And then you start off with the most specific OU up to the most general part of the domain. The most specific would be the Phoenix users OU, in the Phoenix OU, in the Arizona OU, and then DC equals nuggetlab.com, and I'll just press enter here. Redirection was successful. Now let me try this again with a different user account, Phoenix user 12, and I'll enter the password again. And then now we should see this account be created here in the Phoenix users OU, and sure enough, there they are. Why? Because I did use that redirect user command line. And then also here, notice that I've also done this for the redirect computer command now, so it's going to put it into the OU equals Phoenix desktops, and I'll press enter here, and then that's pretty much all I need to do to redirect new computer accounts away from the default computers container. Now, in practicality, what I really do very often with this is I create another OU that's not related to Arizona or anywhere in this hierarchy. It's just directly off the domain, and it might be called the lockdown OU or something like that, and it's going to be highly, highly restricted. And that way, I don't accidentally create user accounts or computer accounts that have too much privilege, and it helps to reduce my attack surface for security purposes. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of other things here. One of the things we want to see here is selective authentication, and this is going to be possibly discussed a little bit more later on, but if we take a look at a couple of forests, here I've got one forest, and then over here I have a totally separate forest. Maybe this is a company that we've recently acquired or a company we have a partnership with. Of course, as we mentioned before, these two will have no relationship whatsoever to one another, but we can create something called a forest trust, and that can be directed one way, or I'm just going to put in both directions here. So this would be a two-way transitive trust, meaning that a resource in this domain down here can be accessed by a user or computer over in this domain over here, or anywhere else throughout this entire hierarchy. Well, the selective authentication, all that does is it allows me to be very discriminating in terms of which accounts can be authorized across these domains here. And then we also have something called constrained delegation. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here, if I go back to Server Manager, I don't really have too many accounts to work with, but let me go to a domain controller, okay? So here's my DC Nugget 1. By the way, notice that this hasn't refreshed yet. That's supposed to be a Phoenix domain controller. If I just, again, refresh the screen, we'll see now that it's refreshed it to Phoenix DC01. But my point in going here is to go to the Properties page, and then this Delegation tab. This has to do with that constrained delegation I told you about just a moment ago. So I could say, trust this computer for delegation to specific services only, or to any service. Now, constrained delegation would say only specific services instead of all of Kerberos services. And I could say, use Kerberos only, and that's for the authentication method, or any other authentication protocol, such as NT-LAN manager methods or something like that. But we're going to stick with this, and my main point in this is, first of all, this is going to be more than we really need to do, but I can identify that this computer can be used for accessing another computer's specific services, and I might be able to handle those services. It might be able to turn them on, turn them off, anything else that it needs to do to access it. And so what I would do is go to Users and Computers, and I might enter in my Phoenix domain controller. What was that? Phoenix DC, I think it was. Yeah, Phoenix DC01. And I can say I want DC Nugget 1, which is the properties that I'm editing here, to be able to work with one of these other services. And I'll just use, the alerter service for the time being. It doesn't really matter which one. My point here is simply to point out that one computer or account can manage the services on another account, or at least access those services. And then Authorization Manager is pretty cool here. What this is going to allow us to do is actually nothing for just normal IT administrators. This is something that's going to be handled programmatically by application developers. But the idea behind this is that an application developer can create an app that allows only certain users with certain characteristics to be able to access certain parts of that app. Now, I mean, think about it. Normally, if I install, Microsoft Word on this computer, anybody who logs on to this computer can access all of Microsoft Word. However, maybe I only want people who have, dial-in privileges. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, let me just quickly show you here. If I go to a user, I double-click on one. If I've enabled dial-in permissions, allowed access, maybe I only want those people that have allowed access to be able to access a certain portion of this application that relates to, VPN connections or something like that, okay? Well, I can do that as an application developer using Authorization Manager. And another advantage of this is that the users don't even have to log off and log back on because the authorization for that is performed when the user tries to access a specific resource. This is going to result in a higher load on the server, but at least the user doesn't have to log off and log back on them as they would have to otherwise if they had something like a group membership change for other kinds of access. And this is not used for network administrators, by the way, to control access to file permissions or network resources or that sort of thing. It's really for portions of an application. And it can be queried based on any user attribute available that is present in Active Directory. All right, let's take a look at the final domain functional level, which of course is Windows Server 2008. Now, as a note here, when you want to raise your domain functional level, you got to keep your eye on the prize. I mean, you don't want to stay with Windows Server 2003 DFL if you don't have to, because once you go to 2008, then you can turn on additional features, and this is commonly true of every successive operating system that Microsoft has. Usually, you want to raise the DFL. Now, the DFL here we're going to get includes all the features of Windows Server 2003 domain functional level, plus the following features. Number one, you do have to have only Windows Server 2008 domain controllers. Okay, so that's going to be, you're limited to only that. And this is really good. You get DFS replication for the sysvol replication. In the past, it's used something called FRS, which is File Replication Service. And it requires quite a lot of overhead, and it's not very efficient on network bandwidth. Well, with DFSR sysvol replication, it does require, a few hoops that you have to jump through. It's beyond our scope right now, but you can, Google certainly for some of these details. But you do have to set this up. But once it sets up, it will give you substantially more efficient network bandwidth utilization and a substantial improvement there. Also, you can again work with this last logon thing. Now, I talked about that before in a previous domain functional level, so why am I repeating it here? Well, it's not exactly the same. This one is similar to that, but this one will also add something like the failed number of logon attempts, for example, since the user's last logon, which workstation they used, and so forth. And this is going to relate to a domain logon for those users. Now, this one's really cool, and this is one I want to spend a little time on as much as I can anyway, and that is fine-grained passwords. Now, with fine-grained passwords, this is something that is going to be a pretty big advantage for a lot of organizations. You see, right now we have a single domain, right? And maybe we set up a domain policy here for, 8-character passwords with complexity, and maybe they have to be at least 7 characters long, and some other things like that. We can also set up the expiration, the lockout threshold, and stuff like that. Okay. Now, once I set that up, I'm limited to that for the entire domain. So in the Tucson office, if my users down here have a top secret project or something confidential they're working on, and they want 12-character passwords, there's no way for me to be able to do that. You might see later on that when we look at group policy objects, it looks as if you can, because in a group policy object, it'll let you do that in the interface. But the reality is, only policies that are linked to the domain level will allow you to set password policy and those sorts of things. Well, this caused some problems. In fact, I worked for a defense contractor a while back when they were architecting their Active Directory structure, and they wanted 2 separate password policies, but they only wanted 1 domain. Well, it was a little bit awkward because I had to tell them they couldn't do that. They just couldn't. So they'd have to have 2 separate domains or more in order to be able to do that for the different secret divisions that they had. Now, if we want to use fine-grained password policies, the first thing we have to do is to raise the Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. Now, I don't really think I've shown you that quite yet directly, so let's do this. We right-click on the nuggetlab.com domain, and then we choose Raise Domain Functional Level. We can see that we're at the Windows Server 2003 level now, but we want to go to the Windows Server 2008. This is irreversible, and you only have to do it on one domain controller in the domain, and then the fact that it's been elevated will be replicated throughout the rest of the domain. Now, the next thing I would want to do is to run ADSI edit, and a lot of this is going to require quite a lot of detail in my editing here, so I'm going to pause recording many times through this and just show you the result of what I'm doing, because this is also probably more detail than we really have to have for the exam. In fact, I know that. For the exam purposes, you need to know that you can come up with fine-grained password policies, but you don't have to know all the details of exactly what to click on and exactly how to do it. But what we'll do here is we'll expand the domain in the naming context here, okay? And it doesn't seem to want to let me expand it, so we'll keep trying to click. Eventually, it'll come to life. Well, finally, it seems to have come to life here. Okay, anyway, so now what we'll do is we're going to go to the system container, okay, and then we'll expand this out, and we're going to go to the password settings container, okay. Once we're into this thing, let me scroll back over here. Once we're into this, what we want to do is to right-click on it and create a new object. So we'll choose New Object. And incidentally, I know you don't have to memorize everything that I'm doing. If it interests you, I'm going to go ahead and put this in a document that'll be titled appropriately on nuggetlab.com. So you can put your pencil for you in a PDF document. And then I want to select the class. It's going to be my password settings, and I just click on Next. And then you just enter in several different values here. For example, this might be Tucson passwords, okay, something like that. Then you enter in several different additional fields, which I'm going to quickly just go through this because it's a little bit more involved than I want to get into in terms of detail. But again, I'll have the PDF document available for you there. And this is going to give us, as I next to this wizard, we're going to have precedence, which is such as whether or not I can use a previous password or not. If I entered in 10, for example, here, that would mean I'd have to go through 10 previously used passwords, or 10 passwords, before I could reuse any of them, whether or not we're going to have a history length of a certain length and so forth. One thing I do want to show you is that things such as that are related to time, like the minimum and maximum password age and the lockout duration, those are all going to be in I8 format, or integer 8 format, which I'm pretty sure is in nanoseconds. And so those are really big, hairy numbers. What you'll probably want to do is to just search the internet for some kind of a conversion calculator to calculate, for example, days into I8 values. But I'm just going to quickly go through all of these, and actually what I've done is I've already gone through the wizard and entered in the values, so you don't have to watch me type them. I'm just going to quickly do this, or could probably address this also when in future nuggets in relation to what password length is, what history length is, what password age is, some of those different things. But all of these things relate to the password that the user can use, whether or not they're complex, so they have to use upper, lower case, and special characters, stuff like that. The minimum password length, things that are fairly well explanatory, but here I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. These again are I8 values, or integer 8, and this, you have to figure out a way to calculate this, but I'll give you a shortcut here in terms of how many zeros to enter in. Almost every time when you enter in zeros on the end of this, it's 9 zeros. Okay, so, and the other thing is, you always have to enter these in a negative format. So that's a minus and then the number, and remember the number has 9 zeros in it, and we'll see that here as well. 9 zeros here starts with a negative. Okay, so again, a negative number and 9 zeros once again, and that's pretty much it. So then once you've finished that, now you have that particular item that you can work with. Now the next thing I want to do is to go back into Active Directory users and computers, and I want to apply this to a specific security group. Now you can apply this new password setting to an individual user if you want to, but I'm going to apply it to a group, and then I'm going to put the users that I want, maybe all these users for example, into this specific security group. And then that way I don't have to apply it to each individual user. So I'll just call this Tucson, users, something like that. Then the next thing I want to do is to access this system container under Active Directory users and computers, which I don't even see right now. Where is it? We have to choose View, Advanced Features, and then now we have System. And then we're going to go down to Password Settings Container. And then we're going to double click here on the Tucson Passwords properties to go to the Attribute Editor. And then we're going to scroll down to MSDS PSO applies to Password Settings Object applies to. And then we're going to add a Windows account. and then we'll just have it to be those Tucson users security group. Okay, and there they are. And, okay. And then that's pretty much all there is to that part of it. And from this point forward, I'm just going to go ahead and stop there because we've already got way more information than you really need to have. But the basic idea now is anybody that would then be a member of that security group would have those fine-grained passwords applied to them, whether they were more or less restrictive than my domain. Okay, I lied just a little bit. I'm not quite done with this. There was one other thing I wanted to show you, and this is something that I've already downloaded and installed just because I did it in the background and offline. But if you go to specopssoft.com, this is an excellent website to get good information and data and tools, actually, about group policy objects. I teach a 5-day course on group policy objects, and this has a lot of stuff that we use. But the thing I want to show you here is not directly related to group policy, I guess, but it's the SpecOps Password Policy Basic item. Go ahead and select on that and then download it, and I've already installed it, so I'll go ahead and show you how it works. And then here I'm going to go ahead and access that software. It's Special Operations Software, SpecOps Password Policy Basic. And I'll click continue. Of course, this is free. There's probably there's another version that's more you'd have to pay for that it gives you more functionality, but this is actually pretty good. I'm pretty much getting what I need out of this utility. So maybe they're giving away too much, but don't tell them that I said that. So anyway, we'll configure a selected domain, and then there's our nuggetlab.com. Here's one I already created. Notice that it can interpret all of the verbiage and the strange numbers that I entered in there, and it can give you the numbers in what I would call, I guess, plain English, more or less. So it's much easier to manage there. We can see that it's going to apply to the Tucson users, and then I can delete that policy, or I can edit the policy, do whatever I want to. Instead of entering in I8 integers of what strange things they have, I can change all of those things now and say, change the password age up or down and so forth. So this is a really cool tool. I think you'll be able to figure out just fine if you just download it and install it. Really cool, but don't use any of this stuff in production quite yet because this really requires some testing and it could be significantly damaging if it's misapplied. So just be careful. All right, I closed up my whiteboard and forgot to put on one more point here, so let me draw it in here. One thing you would additionally get with Windows Server 2008 DFL is the Advanced Encryption Services. That might look familiar because that's an encryption, abbreviation you might have seen or an acronym you might have seen. One of the AES levels you get is now 128-bit, or you can also use 256-bit AES encryption for Kerberos authentication. This is new and it's extremely tight security. Not that Kerberos has been cracked yet. The old version of the encryption that's used in Kerberos was the RC4 HMAC, which is a hash message authentication code encryption algorithm. Basically, all this is really complicated mathematics that encrypts everything that takes place in a Kerberos transaction, and it's very, very tight security now under Windows Server 2008 DFL. All right, then, now moving quickly right along, we're going to move on to forest functional level. What's the difference between domain functional level and forest functional level? Well, remember, you have a forest, okay, and you have domains underneath that, okay? And you might have, different namespace even. But so we have a forest and domains within that. Here I could have a DFL of, let's say, Windows Server 2003, okay, W2K3, and then I might have a domain functional level that's different up here. I might have up here a DFL of W2K8. So within my forest, I could have different domain functional levels. But this also means then that I will have to be limited to a forest functional level of my lowest level domain functional level. So my FFL's highest level, FFL, would have to be W2K3, Windows Server 2003 forest functional level in this case. If I were to upgrade that to Windows Server 2008, then I could upgrade my entire forest functional level also to Windows Server 2008. And this would, of course, mean then that all domains, including any new domains that I also create over here, would be, boy, that's an ugly domain there, but they would have to be also using only Windows Server 2008 domain functional level, and again also using only Windows Server 2008 domain controllers. Wow, isn't that a mouthful? Now, the Windows 2000 domain functional level, of course, would account for the possibility of Windows 2000 domain functional level, native domain functional levels in the environment. So if I might have something like a Windows 2000 domain down here if I was in the Windows 2000 domain functional level. This could also have Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008 domain functional levels in it. Again, notice that since we don't have any room for NT4 here, that we can't use some of the more the decremented versions of some of these older forest functional levels. This just gives us, again, our basic functionality that we have in Active Directory. Now, as we escalate our forest functional level to Windows Server 2003, we get to be able to add the ability to do a forest trust. So here again, I might have a forest, and maybe I got a child domain in that forest, and then I get another forest over here with maybe they've got their own child domain here as well. Two separate companies, no relationship whatsoever to one another, but we have a merger. So now we can create a forest trust between us. We'll talk more about trusts, shortcut trusts, or cross-link trusts, some other things a little bit later on. But for now, what that means is that now I can access resources both directions all the way across these two forests as if they were both promoted together in the same company in the first place. The only exception to that is that if this domain here also had another trust that they had created, maybe another forest trust to somebody over here. Okay, I know that's getting messy. So maybe they created this trust over here. Well, it would not be transitive in such that this forest here would automatically trust this forest. Only in these two forests where we'd explicitly created this trust would that exist. Once again, this forest here would not expressly trust or implicitly trust that forest. Also, we have a domain rename capabilities. This is complicated. I'm just going to tell you right now. It's way beyond what I can demonstrate right here for now. But I'm just going to put in here a tiny URL address for you. http://tinyurl.com, and then it's going to be to BEQTG. No, I didn't memorize that. I'm cheating, and I'm looking on a computer screen that's somewhere else in my office. So I'm entering that in right there. And what that's going to do is redirect you to a Microsoft page that talks about domain rename. It is quite an involved process. The page is for 2003 domains, but it should work for 2008 as well. But if you wanted to do it, then this is where it would take you, and it has quite extensive information on how to do all of this. So if you have to do it, of course, that might be what you need to do. Normally, we don't need to do that unless we have a huge infrastructure change in our environment, or we got bought out, and we now need to change the name of our domain, stuff that's very dramatic like that. We also have something here called linked value replication. What this allows me to do is to take, let's say I got a couple of domain controllers here, and maybe we have a group in these domain controllers. So here's my security group, and it's got a bunch of users in it. I'll just put 2 users. Okay. Now what happens here is through normal replication, of course, this domain controller will also get that group with the 2 users in it as well. Okay. Nothing earth-shattering quite yet. But what would normally happen with Active Directory the way it originally came out is that if I now added yet another user here, and I'm kind of running out of space, I'll just put him here. If I added another user into this, and let's say that each one of these people here represents actually 1,000 users, okay? So let's say this is actually 3,000 users now, and I added one more user for 3,001 users, then what would happen is, in previous Active Directory, it would have to replicate the entire group membership of this whole group over to this domain controller over here, instead of just this one new user account, okay? So now what happens with linked value replication is it's able to discriminate and to pick out just the new objects inside of this security group. So now it replicates only the fact that I have one new user account to add over here, and so then it can do it that way instead of replicating the entire membership of that group. And that ability is called linked value replication. We also have read-only domain controllers in Windows Server 2003 FFL, and we talked about that in a previous nugget. And then we also have improved knowledge consistency checker algorithms, or KCC algorithms. You see, especially if you have a multi-domain and a multi-site and a multi-domain environment, really it mostly relates to sites, but anyway, you have to replicate across potentially many, many different sites, many different domain controllers, and you have to figure out, what's the smartest way to do that? What uses the best bandwidth? What domain controllers are closest to each other in the topology? All those sorts of things. And much of that is automated from our sites using something called the knowledge consistency checker. And this really is an algorithm that takes place inside of something else called the inter-site topology generator, or the ISTG. And that's what sets up our site links between our different locations. And calculates the most efficient replication path between them all. And we'll talk a little bit, of course, a lot more about sites and replication when we talk about sites. And then to finish up here, we're continuing on with more discussion about the forest functional level in Windows Server 2003 forest functional level. With this, you also get the ability to work with the inet.org person and user. But the inet.org person, as I mentioned before, is where we can transfer accounts from other operating systems where they have a lot of equivalent things that we can use in Active Directory. And this essentially becomes an Active Directory account that can be used just like a normal user account. If for some reason, maybe you have an application that can only work with normal Active Directory user account, for example, you could convert an inet.org person to a user, or vice versa, if you had some reason to do that. You can also deactivate or redefine schema object classes and attributes. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, if you had accidentally made a schema object class that you put a typo in, or you made an attribute that was somehow invalid or something like that, then you're stuck with it. You can't delete. There's no delete key, so to speak, for Active Directory schema objects that you create. So what you could do, though, is now you couldn't delete it, but you could deactivate it, at least so that it would kind of become a lame duck there. Or you could redefine it, and so that you might get some usefulness out of a mistake that you might have made. Now, real quickly here, for forest functional level, you can raise that to Windows Server 2008 forest functional level. The thing is, you don't get anything new out of it. We get all the same features that we had in forest functional level of Windows Server 2003. The thing that you would have, though, is if you install new domains in your Windows Server 2008 forest functional level forest, then all those new domains will automatically be promoted to Windows Server 2008's domain functional level. Now let's talk a little bit about how we can raise our forest functional level to a higher level. And we're not going to have the tool that we need directly in here, because we need to look for Active Directory domains and trusts. Notice that does not appear in Server Manager. So I'm going to go here on the Administrative Tools Start menu to Active Directory domains and trusts. And once we're within this, you're tempted to kind of right-click on the domain, but you don't do that. You right-click here on the forest level, and you choose Raise Forest Functional Level, right in front of me there. And then we're right now at the Windows Server 2003. We can raise that to Windows Server 2008. Much like Domain Functional Level, this is irreversible, and you only have to do it in one place. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now, our domain and our forest functional level has been raised to Windows Server 2008. In this nugget, we talked about the functional levels. Remember, we start off with the domain functional level, and with that one, you can get additional features as you escalate or raise your domain functional level to a higher level. For example, we're able to get things such as, at the highest level, such as fine-grained password policies, DFS replication for your sysvol, things like that on the highest level there. And then remember, also for the forest functional level, you get a higher level of capability here as well. Windows Server 2003 has all the features you're going to get now in the forest functional level. And remember, if you raise it to Windows Server 2008 FFL, then you retain all those features. But then any new domains that you create will also be Windows Server 2008 domain functional level. But the overriding thing to remember here between both of these is the higher you raise it, hopefully to Windows Server 2008, then the better functionality and the additional features you'll get out of Active Directory. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.